Professor, I just want to start with you. The prosecutor called out social media. How responsible or irresponsible, in your opinion, was social media in part in this whole shenanigan, as I call it?
What you just heard the prosecutors say is a classic textbook example of propaganda. It's the kind of thing that Hitler used to do in the 1930s. When you have a weak, vulnerable position, what you try to do is you distract the public's attention from your weak position. It's called scapegoating. So the prosecutor scapegoated the victim, Michael Brown. He scapegoated the witnesses who gave testimony against the officer, and he scapegoated the media, the mass media and the social media. When in fact, the reason that there was such a public outcry was because the media accurately reported what was going on in the streets of Ferguson.
I've got to say, I beg to differ on that, Professor. And the reason why I beg to differ is because watching the coverage day in and day out, the thing that came to my mind, and Gwendolyn, I want you to chip on this, and Rebecca, you as well when we get to it, on the whole issue of violence. And the preponderance that the media kept on insisting and seeming like there was going to be violence. And sometimes when you keep on harping on that, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Gwendolyn, I want you, Paul, we'll get to you in a second. Okay. Gwendolyn, can you respond to that?
Well, I will say that in reality, you can make that argument. And I was quite frankly disappointed with some of the shots that the media showed. They showed the protesters, I think, looting, a lot of violence, when in fact the majority of the protesters behaved in a outstanding manner. Mm-hmm. They weren't doing anything inappropriate. So I would have liked to see the media be a little bit more responsible with showing a broader scope.
Paul, hold on a second, hold on. Rebecca, I want you to come back on this discussion here regarding what you have witnessed there in Ferguson and what you have seen in terms of how the media in your eyes cover this, especially when it's come to violence.
Well, I think in my experience on the night when the announcement was made, myself and several fellow reporters were on the scene. I myself was in South City, which is another protest site. And I was marching with the mass group of people when some of the people started to break windows. And the mass group wanted to separate themselves. And they started blowing whistles and they started yelling at the people who were being disruptive and breaking property, damaging local businesses' property. However, police immediately came after the peaceful group and kind of let the others go. They didn't stand in front of the businesses to protect the businesses. Instead, they started tear gassing the mass group. So I think...
Go ahead, Rebecca. Go ahead. No, you make a good point. See, and what I'm saying is, and eyewitnessing this kind of stuff, I don't think we've seen enough reportage on those kinds of things. And Paul, this is the problem that I have with how I think the media has covered this stuff. So much emphasis on the violence, day in, day out, and stories like this, you give like 2 seconds to the good news.
Let's look at the facts. I've studied this. Media scholars have studied this issue. The proposition that what people see on television instigates violence is an old wives' tale. There's not a scintilla of evidence. There's not one bit of reliable evidence that when people see violence on television, they become violent. In fact, what makes people violent are real problems, real mistreatments, things like police brutality, things like police murdering unarmed civilians. That's what makes people violent.
I'm a veteran of 3 riots in this city. 2 in Crown Heights and 1 in Teaneck. And I got to tell you right now, what I saw and what I witnessed, there were a whole lot of copycat people that came out after the fact. You cannot tell me by any kind of one shred of evidence that suggests the otherwise. And I've seen it and I've witnessed this. In this particular case, Gwendolyn, I'm going to tell you too. 57 arrests the day after the shooting. Only 4 of those arrests were from residents of Ferguson. 16 were out of state, okay? And the others were outside of St. Louis County. What does that tell you?
Well, I mean, it could tell you a number of things. It could be that perhaps the police were behaving in a manner, maybe they were targeting people. We don't know the outcome of why those people were arrested. Were their rights being violated? So there's so much more information that needs to come out of it. But again, in terms of the media, I think that, the media has to be responsible. They have to report what's happening in Ferguson because, let's face it, what's happening is really a terrible thing.
Yeah.
We see, the whole judicial system being put in question because there is no justice. But what my problem is when they start focusing on small pockets of violence, I think it just takes everything out of perspective and it paints the whole movement or the whole demonstration in an unfair light.
Okay, well, that'll have to be the last one. I know, Paul, you want to say more, but you'll be back again, of course, and you're just a great guest. Gwendolyn Lindsay-Jackson, of course, was Paul Levinson professor, and Rebecca Rivas over in Ferguson, Missouri. Thank you all for your insight.